last day or so, they've got the results now out of the Moldovan. I think that's correct. Yep, Moldovan. Yep, uh, election that was held, and the pro EU party won. Okay, good. Well, not good in terms of who won. Good as in they've had an election, they've had an outcome. Doesn't appear to have been any violence. Everybody's happy. Well, not quite. So before the election, there was all these claims of Russian election interference, and the Russians were trying to, well, corrupt and influence the election. You heard very similar claims in the lead up to the Romanian elections and the influence there. The way I look at it is you've got one lot of people saying we're not interfering in the stop interfering in the election that we're trying to interfere in, and the other side saying basically the same thing. So, yep, I don't think anyone would be surprised that there were Russian attempts to not necessarily influence the elect. Well, I mean, you could. It depends on how you define influencing. They're not going to, as long as they're not corrupting the election, then allowing Russian favoured or political advertising advertisements in favour of Russian aligned groups doesn't necessarily mean meddling or interference, because you're going to have very much the same on the other side, and it's a very fine line to be dancing down if you don't want people then to look at how you've been funded or who's meddling in your affairs. The thing to be concerned about, I guess, is the amount of meddling that the West has done, or Western Europe and the US and other aligned nations have done in the last 10 to 15 years, and the outcomes that's happened. So there was the Arab Spring, for example, where there are a lot of organic, in inverted commas, protests that erupted across the Maghreb and through the Middle East, seeking to overthrow the governments that were in power at the time, some of which were governments installed by coups, others were strongmen, others were nominally democratically elected but corrupt, all those other bits and pieces. The outcome of a rather violent and bloody Arab Spring in a number of nations was the installation of a more fundamentalist, more hardline, almost theocratic state as the nominal democratic groups that people thought had a chance of winning were swept aside because the broader population is astoundingly conservative or fundamentalist in their beliefs and felt that their representation was better achieved that way. And so this idea, this fiction that was sold that by creating this democratic process that you're going to magically achieve some sort of Nordic social democratic state that was at peace and everyone sat around the campfire singing Kumbaya, whereas it was probably more like Midsummer into the movie, not the celebration. So the issue out of that, plus, I mean, Gaddafi met a rather brutal end, and, well, Libya, I don't think, has really achieved stability since. You also had the civil war in Syria dragged on for quite a long time, and the question is now, has a more brutal strongman or more brutal group taken over compared to the allegations raised against the Alawites or against Assad and his family when they were in power? And what groups or what ethnic minorities within Syria are now protected or not? Yep. There was the claims and counterclaims in the Romanian elections to the point that they threw out the results that they didn't like, that the West didn't like. And so you've got these, and of course we're seeing mainly Western news, so it's obviously very much in favour of the Western viewpoint. If you want to avoid the allegations of meddling or corruption or interfering in an election, you've got to give it a chance to have an outcome that you may not like or want or force. I mean, even Euromaidan in 2014, very clearly meddled with by the West, to the point that here, 11 years later, well, 8 years when it happened, Russia invaded the eastern province oblasts to support the ethnic Russian communities living there that were disenfranchised from the process that went on. So Euromaidan was taking the western half of Ukraine and saying, we're going to do this, we're going to apply this everywhere in the eastern half. Well, the further east you went, the more Russian you became. That they were like, but no, we're not going to cut ties with Russia completely. We're not going to forget our heritage just because you say so, or because somebody sitting in Brussels has made you a promise that, well, they're not following through on, really. But Moldova was, well, a tiny little country, again, formerly Russian when it was, or formerly under Russian control when the Cold War was on. So they've been independent for a while. The problem being here, and it's even freely admitted to the media, is it can be clearly, there can be some clear lines drawn about the potential for irregularities. And they're worth looking at, or they're worth clearer investigation to make sure that there is nothing, that it's all above board. But you're never going to avoid those allegations. It's like the referenda that Russia ran in Crimea and the Eastern Oblasts that went to say that, yep, no, we want to be part of Russia. We want Russia to be here looking after us. That was decried by, well, anybody who wasn't Russia as being farcical. Those of it not being it's not being valid elections. Well, they're about as valid as what happened with Euromaidan. So, anyway, we're not talking about them right now. So, yep, the pro-European party of the current president has claimed victory. And I think it's like 50.3% or something like that. Yep, complaining about Russian interference and saying Russia had thrown everything it had at the election. No, they hadn't. But hey, look, if it gets you headlines and makes someone in Brussels like you, then hey, fine, whatever. Yeah, okay, the opposition party's being a little bit delusional here. However, 99% of the 1.6 million votes counted, so relatively small country. It is tiny. Like, if you've looked at a map, it's jammed in between Romania and Ukraine, and is, and then even has a breakaway republic, Transnistra, I think it's called, which is even more ethnically Russian or more Russian aligned. So yeah, 50.17% of the vote. So basically, they've returned a majority. 24.1% for the Patriotic Electoral Bloc, which is Russian aligned. So yep, not a problem. Only half the population turned out. Again, coming from a country where voting is mandatory, the idea that you can have elections where barely half the voting population turns up and be able to claim a mandate from that just boggles the mind. I mean, the US has had issues over the years of people claiming that just because a president was voted in or a Congress was voted in the way it was, it doesn't really represent the populace, because only a minority of the population came out to vote. Well, if you don't come out to vote, you can't claim they represent you or they don't represent you. Yeah, boggles the mind. Boggles the mind. Yep, obviously the EC president is like, yep, Europe, democracy, freedom. Yeah, yeah. Polish Prime Minister obviously stopped Russia in its attempts to take over the region. Okay, Zelensky obviously jumping up and down, saying Russia's destabilizing activity loses. All right, they're gonna see things like that. What you want to hear though is what did the Russians say? Because if that first part of the article is correct, that the Russians are attempting to destabilize and whatever else, well, what do the Russians have to say in conclusion after the election? Okay, they're saying that there weren't enough polling stations in Russia, and some articles said that there was only two. Well, in fact, he just said there's two there, and that there was almost as many Moldovans in Russia as there were in Moldova, and they only had access to two polling stations. Now, clearly, the Moldovans in Russia are more than likely going to be voting in favour of a Russian-aligned political party. So when the US had their presidential elections and congressional elections, you hear lots of complaining about disenfranchisement of voters because there's not enough polling stations in minority areas or they're being open for fewer hours, all this sort of thing. It's attempts to disenfranchise voters by legally holding the election, but doing so in a manner that the eligible voter can't get to the polls or can't complete a valid vote. So, in this case, where you've got as many, well, allegedly as many Moldovans in Russia as there were in Moldova, only having two polling stations suggests disenfranchisement, at least if you're going to hold the election to the same standard that we want to hold everyone else to. So immediately that stands up as, okay, that's not great. Now, the country itself's only got a couple of million people. It may not have the funds to put 20 or 30 polling stations across Russia. So there's a cost, not an opportunity cost, it's a feasibility thing. Is it really feasible to have more than a couple of polling stations open for the diaspora? Well, possibly, because there was, I'm going to say, there were polling stations in many other countries as well. So the question is, okay, given how many would be in Russia versus other countries, is it appropriate to put more polling stations where there's more people, even if they don't believe in the party line of the party you want? Again, coming from a country where we have a quite independent, now there's allegations of a bit of influence, but the Australian Electoral Commission is pretty much independent of the political parties. It's a government body, so in essence, you could argue the government of the day controls it, but by and large, it's independent. And so they'll go through all the process of doing up polling papers, setting up polling stations, doing the order of candidates on the voting papers and everything, doing everything as possible to keep it above board. So coming to watch how other nations handle it is, again, just leaves me scratching my head as to how you get a process like that done without allegations of corruption, disenfranchisement, voter suppression, all those sort of things. I mean, maybe that's just the way people do things, and that it's expected to be corrupt in some way. The suggestion that recent votes are close, have been far closer than this election, also suggests that there may be something at play. If you've got, when you're looking at fraud through statistical means, accounting fraud, generally, uh, financial fraud, you look for the aberration in the trend. You look for something that sticks out. And if the numbers return to the trend afterwards, you go and look, why did that figure stick out? Sometimes you just have an outlier, and that be the case. But generally, there needs to be a well understood reason for why these figures stick out. So you look at the US presidential elections, for example, there is a well defined trend in terms of voters for Republican and Democratic Party candidates over years. Like, you can draw a very decent line of best fit. Now, the party figures like swap back and forth as they vote the president of that party in or out, etc. But by and large, there's a decent line of best fit that follows until you get to the 2020 election, where you had this incredible spike of returns, and the returns favoured Biden over Trump. And from a statistical point of view, from a trend line, it stands out as, well, there's a clear, if it's not an error, there's an outlier for a reason. Now, people point to the very high use of mail-in ballots as being the reason for that, or higher levels of engagement. But if that's the case, why didn't that happen in 2016 when people, by and large, believed that Hillary Clinton had it locked in? Why then wasn't it repeated in 2024 when you had the opportunity to vote Kamala Harris in? And the figures from 2016 2024 fit basically within the line of best fit, within reason. And so people look at that and go, The only other suggestion is that the election in 2020 was corrupted in some way. Now, clearly afterwards, Biden was appointed and carried on by the processes established, so it's academic, really. But to look at it, the arguments given for why that spike appears like it does fail the basic sniff test. They fail in comparison to prior and post other elections. It doesn't stand up to scrutiny, really. And if you're looking at it in terms of an accounting spreadsheet as allocation of funds to various things, you'd see a spike like that as, hang on, there's something going wrong there. It's like people who falsify figures, there's human patterns. People unwittingly default to certain patterns of numbers when making numbers up. And over time, they'll stand out. And that's how financial fraud investigators and auditors, they're trained to look for this sort of stuff. So when you've got elections like here, where they say recent votes are far closer, or other elections in Moldova are generally much closer, to suddenly have such a big gap appear, you've got to ask what's caused it. Why is this the case? Now, you could argue that, it's because of Ukraine, but you've got Transnistra, you've got plenty of Moldovans living in Russia, so that argument kind of falls flat a little bit. So the fact that they've returned a similar percentage for the party in power, okay, that's fair enough. The inability of the Russian-aligned party to return figures similar to their previous elections is what smells. Now, the OSCE, which I think it actually talks about it down here towards the end, European, or maybe it must be in the ABC coverage. Anyway, so yep, they've returned. They may have to do a coalition with some of these other blocks in order to keep the Russian bloc out, but at over 50% of the return, that basically means that it's impossible to for the Patriot Electric Bloc to form power, but it still needs additional power, additional returns. Bomb scares, but they're not saying where they came from. Criminal groups backed by Moscow, apparently. So again, but that's the person in the European aligned thing is obviously going to blame everybody else. Yep, Transnistra. There you go. Now, Transnistrians have Moldovan passports. It's still part of Moldova, but they are strongly aligned with Russia, and they're claiming that they were disenfranchised as well. And even though they've had a pro-European president, they've got high levels of inflation and high levels of corruption. So, yeah, you talk about scare tactics from the Russians. Well, this is scare tactics from the pro-European. Don't play with your vote, you'll lose everything. And, yeah, well, this dude's a little bit deluded in that regard. We're good with that. Okay, it's... Yeah, no, I think most people are like, yep, no, fair enough. The issue here as well is that they banned opposition parties right at the very, very close to the point it was run. Now, the map here, so Transnistria is this little thin sliver next to Ukraine. Down here is Odessa, and you can see it's not even 20 k's across, and the whole country is only like 100 k's across. It's not massive. It's not a big country by any stretch of the imagination. But to have some of the opposition parties banned like days out from the election, that's not going to attract attention at all. And now it may be valid that it was illicitly funded. Everybody's got to put themselves towards that. So, unprecedented effort by Russia to spread disinformation by votes. I thought we moved past the whole idea of fake news. Well, it's pro-Russian propaganda and fake news. So that's just saying post content that opposes what the BBC says. And quite likely, you're hearing stuff now out of Russia or sympathetic to Russia saying that, well, no, you've done it to sow discord, and that you're doing the same thing yourself as an effort to distract from the internal issues. So, it's great that they've got processes to, once you're in the polling station, to attempt to ensure accuracy and everything else. But it's interesting. We'll see. Scaremongering, quite clearly. But who's to say? I mean, it sounds like people are afraid of a Cold War coming up, but and there you go. You disenfranchised voters inside Transnistria. A long queue of cars waited to drive to 12 polling stations outside the border, some of them more than 20 k's away. So indicate that you returned a much lower number of voters from that region, which speaks to disenfranchisement when you can so specifically tie it to an ideology, to a physical region, that these people here who are more likely going to be Russian aligned weren't able to vote. or weren't able to vote effectively, and then had vehicles scanned and checked before moving through. So of course it's a procedural delay. It's work to rule, and so yeah, it's different. Now, there's an interesting statement for why he's voting against the government. Well, because they promised the world and delivered nothing. So other than that, voting preference is secret, which is good, which is what you want. You want a secret ballot. You want, obviously, you want people to walk out of the ballot booth knowing that how they voted is a secret and that their vote is counted accurately. You want it to be secret because you want to avoid standover tactics by political groups, by armed gangs, by criminal elements from a whole bunch of people. You want to allow people to have the freedom to make their own mind up and for that choice to remain private. But that's good. So yeah, that's the initial thing. I mean, that was the first article I saw on it. We'll come back to that because the ABC had an article as well on the Moldovan outcome. Okay, yep, success. It's going to be coming off the wires. Yep, so ABC added it. So basically coming off the wires. I think this is the one that I saw that it had the OSCE element. So there's nothing new to be added up top here. Same basic percentages, same responses from European leaders, same rattling of sabers from Zelensky. Basically rewording the claim out of Russia about disenfranchisement due to only 2 polling stations. This is the first article, though, that points up there being an energy crisis within Moldova, and that, yep, they are suffering an economic downturn. Quite clearly, we got one of their neighbours is busy engaged in a conflict. It's going to be difficult. In a sense, surprising that a government party managed to hold on to a majority in Parliament and not get its position eroded. Well, it did. It was down to 50.1 from 54, even with the inability of Transnistrians to get to polling stations or Moldovans in Russia to get to more than 2 polling stations. There's, you can't claim no one was disenfranchised as a result. Although they're still saying all the Russians did multiple destabilizing techniques and malign interference in the electoral processes. We just explained the irregularities or the things that are going to stand out that deserve to have a good answer provided for them. It's like Russia was interested in Moldova because its position could allow a second front to be opened in its war in Ukraine. No, you're jumping at shadows there. I don't think Moldova is necessarily more important than, say, Odessa. It's certainly something that Russia, if it was to take Odessa, would certainly be okay with connecting up with Transnistria and potentially the rest of Moldova, but I don't see it as having a geostrategic importance more than, say, Odessa. So, but hey, you're allowed to express your national interests. This is a statement that wasn't in the BBC article and doesn't seem to have really any basis in any reporting that's come out in the last several years, that they're using it as a lab for hybrid warfare. But the question is, like, okay, so they're claiming hybrid warfare is like using drone attacks and everything else. It's like, well, hang on. The more open reporting about alleged Russian interference in elections and stuff, apart from the US, was in Romania. And, well, or even, Germany to an extent with the AFD, but, well, I think people realise that's just rhetoric. And even in Romania, it's not been proven or demonstrated that anything other than the fact the non-EU aligned people won in the first rounds. So, good that everyone feels free to vote. Obviously, they were part of the breakup of Russia, the USSR. Okay, so they targeted illicit party funding and alleged Russian-backed networks. So, how is that any different from European-based backed networks on the other side? And that's the thing, you've got to be fair. You've got to allow people to have their voice, even if you don't like that voice. So, I didn't know that the opposing guy was prior president, but I don't think the documents claiming electoral violations are going to go anywhere. Sorry to say. They're declaring, this is where he's declared that the diaspora was what held the voting together for the party returned in power, because, well, obviously there's a lot working through Europe, but they go in a little bit more detail here about the Transnistra things. Transnistra? Well, depending on where you read it. So the article says, he said without providing evidence that the people living there, more than 200,000 of them, that's more than enough to swing the election, were denied the chance to vote. Okay, fair enough, you can argue that. The current president, said, no, we could not influence what happened in a region that did not recognise Moldovan government control. Well, are they part of your country or not? So, they didn't provide, from the other article, no, they didn't provide any voting stations inside the region. He forced them to leave the region, and then went over each and every vehicle and group of people that left to vote. Forced them to show papers and investigated vehicles. Yeah. So the OSCE. Now, this group is one that I'd never heard of prior to, say, 2016-ish. Well, maybe 2014. But they're a group which I'm not 100% sure who coordinates them, whether they're out of the EU or not. But they were present in Luhansk and Donetsk pretty much from 2014, documenting what they saw. Now, clearly, they only had access allowed to them by whoever was fighting, predominantly Ukrainian access, but they did a fairly decent job trying to provide a balanced view, not necessarily a balanced viewpoint, to try and provide a neutral viewpoint on what was going on, or attempted to document more than anything else. And so to see them show up for this election, yeah, cool. All right, what have they got to say? It's competitive despite flaws. The fact that it's competitive, even with the claims of suppression, makes me wonder what sort of returns the other party would have had everyone been able to vote. So, a high level of commitment to democratic processes, not a problem. Unprecedented hybrid threats coming from Russia, which doesn't explain what they are. It's easy to have a throwaway line like that as an excuse to excuse for the excesses that you carry out yourself, not the OSCE. So the OSCE said, removing those parties from the ballots a couple of days before, limited their right to seek remedy, and there was illegal financing was the alleged reason why. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens. Yeah, 7% inflation, power problems. Yeah, that's an issue for them, sadly. All right, what? So that's Moldova. That's elections.